Today on Biblical Higher Ed Talk, I sit down with Frank Weller, president of Great Lakes Christian College, to discuss his experiences in leading a college from survival to flourishing. Thank you for tuning in today. I'm your host, Philip Dearborn, president of ABHE, and we are honored to have as our guest this week, Frank Weller. Frank is the president of Great Lakes Christian College, and he assumed the presidency 2 years ago. And it's been neat for me to see the progress, kind of from a distance, over those 2 years of really taking the college to a place of health and sustainability. And I've invited Frank in to talk about his leadership journey so far at Great Lakes. So Frank, welcome to the show.
Philip, thank you for having me. It's a delight to be here.
Absolutely. So we're going to get into our questions here in a second, but I do want to thank our sponsor for this week, Moody Bible Institute, one of our founding members of ABHE, doing great work there in Chicago, as well as around the world. So to kick off our conversation, Frank, talk to us, help our audience get to know you a little bit. Tell us a defining moment in your life that propelled you forward to where you are today.
Sure, Philip. You know, in 2019, I was a recently minted Doctor of Ministry graduate, and I just really was seeking the Lord for what was going to be the last 1/3 of my career. What did God want for me to do, and what kind of legacy did he want me to leave? And about that time, I began meeting with a cohort of 5 younger preachers, all in their late 20s, early 30s, and just began pouring into them and really found a lot of fulfillment in that. And I began to wonder, hey, God, maybe this is what you have for me for the rest of my life. And as it happened, we ended up journeying through COVID together because we began that cohort just in the very early months of 2020. And as I worked through that time together with those young preachers, then I learned that GLCC's president was retiring, and he asked me to consider applying for the position. And I thought, okay, God, I've wondered if you want me to invest in younger people and spend the last third of my career on the next generation of ministry professionals. And now here's this opportunity. And I just really saw the Lord in that, urging me to consider that as a career change.
Yeah. So I'm sure when you were a teenager growing up, your aspirations were, it's one day I will be a college president.
No, I grew up on a farm in Northeast Indiana. And I didn't know whether God was going to call me to be a farmer and go to Purdue University, or whether he was going to call me to pursue ministry. And as it happens, I ended up going to Great Lakes Christian College, which is where I serve now. Yeah. And that really changed the trajectory of my life.
Wow. Great story. And our story of connecting, somebody put us together and said, hey, Frank is this new president, and they may be interested in ABHE membership. So I'll never forget coming and visiting. And I don't think you had even started at that point. Like it was in June and you're starting July 1st or something like that. And I'll never forget that first meeting. And you're probably like, who is this guy?
Well, I knew who ABHE was because the college was accredited by AABC, the predecessor association. But yeah, I mean, I had barely started and you arrived, and I thought, that showed such care and concern for me as a president, a new president, and for our institution. It really left a deep impression on me.
Yeah. So when we were together a couple of years ago, the institution was in a different place, and we're going to kind of talk through that. You had served on the board, you had attended as well. You were stepping into the senior leadership position. So talk to us about that specific call to ministry and your mindset going into it.
Well, I looking back on it, I feel a little bit like the rookie who's set up in the bottom of the ninth with the game on the line. And if everybody about there is losing their head and you're not, perhaps you don't have a clear understanding of the situation. And that was kind of how I look back on it. I started in June, but in April, the team pulled together a meeting for me and said, listen, By June 1st, you're going to be out of cash. The
Hmm.
line of credit will be completely maxed out. We don't know how you're going to make payroll this summer. If you cannot acquire another $500,000 in cash this summer, you will not open in the fall. And so it was tough sledding right out of the gate. In addition to that, we had just undergone a peer review from our accrediting association, and that resulted in a recommendation of a probation sanction. And so 1 month after I began, I sat in front of the Institutional Actions Council of our accreditors, and we were placed on probation. And so it was really difficult to begin. And it's been a slow, steady march in the right direction as we've seen God really work in a number of different ways to move us from a place of just survivability now to beginning to think about sustainability and eventually soaring. We just have seen God work, and it's been really encouraging for me and for the whole team.
Yeah, yeah. Obviously, you probably knew some of kind of what you were stepping into because you had served on the board. But how soon were you able to realize the full picture?
I'll push back on your premise just a little bit. Our board at the time did not have the development that we have now. We participated in ABHE's Board Governance Excellence Program, and it's really transformed our board. Prior to my becoming president, and I served as chairman of the board, our board really functioned more as a sounding board or perhaps even as just a board of affirmation rather than really digging into some of the important fiduciary details. And so while we had been made aware of the financial challenges that the college was experiencing, I don't really know that we fully understood the ramification of things like deferred maintenance and depreciation and negative net assets. We didn't really understand all of those. I certainly do now, but we've since added a lot of subject matter experts to the board who can help guide us through that. So I knew that there were financial challenges, but I just really at the time didn't understand how deeply those financial challenges were going to impact the institution going forward.
Yeah, and that's we've had a couple episodes talking about effective board governance and the importance of one, having the right board, but two, that the board has the right kind of information to lead the institution effectively. And it sounds like that necessarily wasn't in place because it was a surprise to you, kind of walking in. Oh boy, what really have I done? So did you question God's call on your life at that point?
Well, I went home after that fateful April meeting where they handed me a pro forma budget that said you're expected to lose $600,000 in the next fiscal year, and you already have negative net assets as an institution. And I told my wife, this may be the shortest presidency in the history of presidents. I remember very clearly. She said, "Do you regret making the decision?" And I said, we believe that God called us to this. We believe strongly that God called us to this. And while we may be surprised, he is not.
Yeah.
He knew what the situation was when he called us into this role. And so there wasn't really a sense of regret. Certainly I was uneasy and deeply concerned, but we had still felt a strong sense of calling to what we were getting into.
Yeah. Yeah. And just as our listeners understand, I mean, you're working hard, you've come a long way, and you've even shared this with me, like this is a work in progress, right? But the thing I want our listeners to know in hearing and unpacking some of your lessons, even just 2 years into this transformation, is the hard work that you and your team have been on to just get the organization, and momentum is such an important piece to organizations. And so you had negative inertia that you were having to overcome to kind of come to now the point that you can actually be forward looking. And I think that's what we really want to focus in on over the past 2 years. So you've been a pastor for most of your professional life. And as a pastor stepping into the role of college president, what was that like?
In our fellowship of churches, it is not unusual for Bible college presidents to be former pastors.
Okay.
And, I think, for example, Marshall Leggett, who was at Milligan University and
Mm-hmm.
has had a great legacy at Milligan, he's sort of the prototypical pastor turned president. And so it's not unusual in our churches because they're so Bible focused. There were some skills that transferred, but there were many who did not. I tell you, one of the big ones is just this is so much more complex, and I'm always hesitant to say that because when you're a pastor, you think about the complexities of that role,
Sure.
and it is complex. Certainly, with dealing with a board, and every time you preach, you have 200 to 400 critics in the audience. There's still a budget to deal with, but stepping into this role, we had 6 times as many employees as the church I was serving, and the budget was 6 times as large, and so many moving parts. If you pull one lever, say in enrollment, then it affects levers in financial aid, it affects levers, it affects outcomes in finance and operations, just so complex. And so I've had to really learn on the fly how to deal with much more complex situations.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you some of the skills that have transferred, though. One of them is just the ability to self-edit a little bit.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is the church I was serving prior to becoming president was really diverse, not especially racially, although it's become more since, but very much politically. We're in Michigan's capital city, and so we had a wide range of diverse political opinion in that church. And I had to be really careful to make certain that I was focused on Christ and Him crucified.
Mm-hmm.
And there were times where I would find myself in conversations where I had to make sure I kept the main thing, and kept my personal opinion to one side. Certainly in the way I portrayed myself in social media, that was the case. I didn't become embroiled in some of the more controversial topics of our day. And I think that served me well as president, too. Communicating vision is an important part of what I did as a pastor. And that's a big part of what I do as president, too. And then certainly raising money. When you communicate vision, you have to resource that vision. The skills I learned in raising money as a pastor, I've been able to transfer into my role now.
So even though in biblical higher education we see that, and it makes sense at some level, the connection of a senior pastor of a church stepping into a leadership role like a college or university president, it seems like it makes sense, but like you've expressed, there are some challenges, and it's not to take away and say that a senior pastor position is not complex. Obviously it is. It's a different kind of complexity that things don't necessarily transfer over. And it's not to say that pastors can't make good college presidents. It's more a question of making sure in the vetting process as the board hires the president who happens to be a pastor, that they have the capacity to grow and learn in a totally different environment where dynamics just are fundamentally different. And I think that's an important piece.
No, that is. I think that the learning piece is critically important. So I learned just before the pandemic that my predecessor was going to be retiring in 2 years, and I was asked to consider applying. And so then the pandemic happened, and I tell people I learned to do 2 things during the pandemic. I learned how to bake the perfect Toll House cookie, and I learned how to run a college. So I spent 2 years just immersing myself in higher education literature and interviewing college presidents, both those who were still active and those who were retired, and just trying to wrap my head around the issues that are facing Christian higher education. And the ability to be able to learn, I think, has served me well. I read a ton, and, I'm still learning.
Yeah.
Not knowing what you don't know, that's a challenge, but I at least need to have enough self-awareness to know that I needed to learn some things.
Yeah.
And that has served me well.
And there's a humility that comes into that, that sometimes is a struggle that, leadership is leadership. It's just the environment is different, and I can just step in and just lead exactly the same way. And it's simply not the case. And you have to take the position of a learner. And you've done a good job with that. So you're in the process leading Great Lakes forward. A lot of hard work. I'm sure you do. Like I said before, you feel like there's a way to go. But step back Tell us 3 keys from your experience that contributed to the forward momentum that you are now experiencing. 3 keys.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I've been pondering that. I think probably one of the most important is just to lead with transparency.
Mm-hmm.
There's I think, a tendency in institutions of higher education to, I grew up in Northeast Indiana on a hog farm, and we call it put lipstick on the pig. I think we try to shine things up a little bit, because if the fear is if folks find out the difficulties at our institution, then that's going to put a lot of downward pressure on enrollment.
Right.
And that's been the case historically here. I can recall back in the late 80s where there was an existential crisis, and the board was very transparent about that. And enrollment the following semester plummeted by 60%. And so there's just a fear that, boy, if we let folks know how difficult things are, they might not send their students or might not enroll. We just took a different approach. We said, look, we're going to be transparent. We're going to be honest. And we're going to trust that will build credibility in our administration. Mm-hmm. And people will know that, okay, that they understand that there's a problem. They are aware, and that they are dealing with the problem. So we really tried to build trust through transparency.
So to just go a little bit further with that, like how does that play itself out in day to day with the team? Because obviously you can't be transparent about everything that happens, right? Personnel related issues, there's some limitations there. But what does transparency look like at Great Lakes?
Well, I met monthly with our entire team. We have an all staff meeting every month. And every month I would give them an update. I would say, we began the year with a $600,000 deficit, and here's where we're at right now. We are operating from a dynamic budget. So as we have inputs and as we have savings, we've shared with the team, this is where we're at. Okay. We were at $600,000 deficit, and now we're at a $270,000 deficit. And hey, great news. As of today, we're projecting that we're going to break even. So just trying to be very transparent with our team was a big part of that. When we received the probation sanction, we communicated with our entire student body via chapel services. I stood in front of them and said, here's what this is. Here's what this means. We sent letters to every one of their parents. We communicated via our social media channels and through press releases. We just said, hey, things are difficult, but we understand the gravity of the situation and we're dealing with it. So it was just repeated communication, even going so far as to setting up extra pages on our website to answer frequently asked questions. The more we communicated, I think the more we built our credibility.
Yeah, that's so true. Leaders define reality. That's a leadership axiom, and that transparency is part of that. So that's the first key. What else?
So the second one is we really began focusing on relationships. I read something on David Wright's LinkedIn a while back. He, a longtime president at Indiana Wesleyan University, and he said, colleges don't close because they run out of money. Colleges close because they run out of relationships. And I thought that was just brilliant. When I became president, I discovered that many of the relationships that we had with supporting churches and with alumni and with individual donors had become cold. Part of that was just a result of the pandemic and timing and the inability to travel and stay connected as well as my predecessor would have liked. But part of that was just relational entropy, that relationships tend to wither and die unless they are continually attended to. And so I began working really hard to restore relationships. I put 25,000 miles on the Subaru and flew to nine different states in my first year. And I've kept a pretty hectic travel schedule ever since. And I think that that's really begun to pay some dividends as those relationships are being restored.
Yeah. I've observed, you're active on social media, and, it's like a block and tackle approach, right? You can talk strategy all you want, but at the end of the day, it's block and tackle and relationships. And I've heard the saying vision leaks. I would say relationships leak too, that if you're not our tendency is to think, okay, well, we have that existing relationship with that church. We had it for 5 years. I don't really have to cultivate that relationship anymore, but that's not the case. People change, circumstances change, and you have just been at it almost every single weekend. You are off to another church speaking, you're off to a camp, telling the story of Great Lakes and ministering at the same time. And that's you're starting to see payoff.
Yeah, we are. And, social media, that's been a very intentional strategy on my part. Look, I'd much rather be posting pictures of barbecue and of our two pups. But what I want to communicate via social media is, hey, President Weller is active and he is promoting the college and he is on the road and he is working hard. And it's interesting you say it looks like I'm somewhere every week, because I'm really not. I'm only out about every other week. But the perception sort of has a cumulative effect. As people see I'm one place and then another place, then a third place. Eventually they begin to think, okay, he's gonna get around to me too. And the requests to speak start to roll in, and we're able to really repair a lot of those relationships. So that's been a really intentional strategy on our part.
Yeah, in fact, somebody created a sticker of you, right? Because of all of the images that you had, which was kind of a fun little picture of you. You're right; it's cumulative; it builds, and I know there are a lot in our camp that's averse to social media, but boy, it's a powerful tool that you can use, and it's not self-promotion. I've hit that criticism as well. Like, if you're posting on social, it's all about you and it's about what you're doing. And there's an aspect to that, but there's a way to leverage it in a way that tells a very positive story of, look, you're at alumni churches that are being pastored by folks who have graduated from Great Lakes. Well, that connection is so critical. One, it encourages them. You're physically there and Great Lakes is on their mind because you happen to be with them. So, I mean, there's tremendous value in it if used correctly.
That's exactly right.
So what's your third key?
Well, the third one is I tried to begin to develop some forward momentum early on, even if it was just small. You may recall, if you're a history guy, I love history, but shortly after the Pearl Harbor bombing that began World War II, Roosevelt instructed his generals to come up with a response, and the Doolittle raid on Tokyo was a result of that. Now, materially, the Doolittle raid didn't have a significant effect on the outcome of the war, but what it did is it demonstrated to the American people that, hey, we're going to do something. And so I tried to take the same approach when I began at GLCC, even in some tiny little ways. I went to our academic division and said, hey, if we could just do one tiny little thing, what would make a difference for you? What would show you, hey, we're appreciated and we're headed in a better direction? And they said, you know what? We need new lecterns for each of our classrooms. They just look bad. Some of them are broken. They don't function. And I spent $700 that we really didn't have purchasing lecterns for our classrooms. Just so that our students could see that, our faculty could see that. They appreciated that. I found a company who came in and put down new surfacing on the concrete patios of our women's residence, and we bought some $30 Adirondack chairs to sit on those patios. We try to do some little things that demonstrated some forward momentum. And I actually overheard a conversation by a couple of students when we had made one of those inputs. They said, I guess we're going to be all right, or they wouldn't be putting any money into this thing. And so we really tried to find ways to build forward momentum and portray that, hey, we're moving forward in spite of the challenges that we were facing.
Yep. So celebrate the small wins, and those do become cumulative. So your top two leadership challenges that you're willing to share with a public audience so far?
Yeah, well, I'm going to give you two and then maybe a third if we have time. But
sure.
The biggest one is, it's not surprising. It's just changing culture. Someone said, I don't recall who, but changing culture is like trying to turn around a barge in the Ohio River. There are just dozens and dozens of tiny little changes. Yeah. And we've been doing that. One of the big ones is we've really focused on recruiting more mission fit students and mission fit student athletes. When you're in an enrollment crisis, the tendency is to recruit anybody with a pulse. And I remember just my first year here, we had 12 students on one of our athletic teams or one of our JV teams that just were not a good mission fit and caused a disproportionate amount of problems spiritually on our campus. And, we had to move in another direction, and that was difficult. But we've created a culture here now, or we are creating a culture where we set our expectations, and then there's accountability for those expectations.
Yeah.
And that's at every level. That's administration, faculty, staff, and students. And we're really now beginning, just in the start of my third year, we're beginning to see that pay off. So changing culture has been a significant challenge for us, but I think one that's going to pay off.
And I'd imagine that's further complicated by the fact that it was a losing team. Not that they were losers, but the team was losing, and to change that mindset and culture away from a losing culture to now a winning culture, that's double, triple the amount of work than in any other normal environment to kind of create some sense of synergy. So that totally makes sense. So what's the second challenge?
Well, really, it's the accreditation sanction that we've dealt with. That's cost us. I calculate it's cost us between $80,000 and $100,000 to ameliorate the probation sanction, and we're not there yet. We have one more meeting with the full board of our accrediting association, but all the indicators are that the sanction will be removed and will be returned to the standard pathway. But that's created problems in a number of different areas. We have a local group that was going to provide a significant scholarship for any graduates of the local school system, and they pulled back when they found out we were placed on probation. I've talked with parents of students that have gone to competing institutions. I said, why did you do that? You're an alumnus. Why did your son go to, XYZ college? Well, we saw that the college was placed on probation, and such and such college had closed, and such college was on the verge of closing, and we just didn't want to take that risk. And so it's been a huge challenge to ameliorate the accreditation probation. And I have to tell you, it's been so painful that I don't expect we'll allow ourselves to be in that situation again anytime soon. And perhaps that's the point of the pain.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And when probation happens these days, it's rare for an institution to turn around, which is why I think I wanted you on the show to just kind of talk about it. And I certainly appreciate all that you've shared. We have 2 minutes left. So we have a broad audience of listeners. A lot of them are starting their leadership careers. What's a word of encouragement that you'd like to leave with our listeners?
I would say this, and I learned this when I went to my first ABHE President's Conference. I don't remember who it was that said this, but it was incredibly helpful. They said, develop a stewardship mindset, not an ownership mindset. And whatever organization you're leading, if it's an organization that exists to glorify God, that's critical. Have a stewardship mindset. It's not my college. I'm not responsible for whether or not it survives. I'm simply responsible to get up and go to work every day in the Lord's vineyard and to do the very best I can. That's helped take the pressure off of me, and it's helped put the glory where it belongs, on the Lord Jesus Christ.
So that was Scott Rodin, probably, who did that, written a book on it. And it's powerful. It's been powerful for me too, to recognize it. There's a sense of freedom that also comes with that we're not owners of this thing. Our Heavenly Father is the owner. So that's the freedom you experience, but then the responsibility that comes in, that God holds us accountable for what He has entrusted to our care. It's the parable of the talents. And someday we will be held in account for what He has put under our stewardship. And so you've modeled that and demonstrated that well. Frank, thank you for joining us. Thanks for sharing your wisdom and honestly, your wide open experiences. And thanks for being vulnerable with us today.
It's my pleasure. We're just so grateful for ABHE and the way that they're blessing our organization. And we just are thrilled about the partnership and look forward to it growing over the years.
Fantastic. And again, thank you to Moody Bible Institute and their sponsorship of our podcast. So until next time, stay kingdom focused.